The Imprecatory Psalms are some of the more difficult psalms to interpret. These are the psalms of cursing. They're also called psalms of anger or psalms of wrath. The term imprecatory has been around for some time, and so that's the term that we'll use in psalm studies. These psalms create difficulties, and for this reason, some churches even don't use them. They prescribe that these psalms be avoided in public worship because, frankly, the church is a little embarrassed by the terminology and the attitude that these psalms present. I think that's probably an overreaction, and I think you'll see why as we unpack the problem of the imprecatory psalms and look to some solutions. There are at least 7 psalms that fit into this category, although you can find imprecations throughout the psalms, particularly in the laments. There are 7 that are identified as predominantly imprecatory, with 35, 69, and 109 being the most intense. Of course, 137 may be the most famous for its description of the killing of children. Let's look at some examples of these imprecations. Psalm 55, let death take my enemies by surprise, let them go down to the grave alive. In other words, may death come suddenly and swiftly upon my enemies. Here's some metaphors in Psalm 58, like water that seeps into the ground as it flows away, like a slug that melts moving along, leaving its silvery trail, and then like a stillborn child never seeing the light of sun. Each one of those perhaps a little more intense as we move to higher forms of life. Psalm 58 also, another familiar one, the righteous will be glad when they're avenged, when they bathe their feet in the blood of the wicked. Of course, we have that expression, a blood bath, that is drawn from this particular verse. Consume them in wrath, consume them till they are no more. So clearly spoken in anger. And then one of the more familiar ones, Psalm 137, speaking of both the Babylonians and also the Edomites. Happy is he who repays you for what you've done, who seizes your infants and dashes them against the rocks. What do we do with this kind of language? A language that is used by the psalmist to describe his enemies in stark terms, dehumanizing terms, as animal-like. How do we reconcile that with the idea that all people are created in the image of God and have inherent dignity and worth? Furthermore, the psalmist prays that God will bring the people the most worst imaginable fates upon both them and innocent people, and it's particularly the innocent people that are so troubling. The psalmist will pray in Psalm 109 that even this curse would fall upon the enemy's family, his children and his grandchildren for generations. And how do you reconcile these prayers with Jesus' teaching in the New Testament on anger, that we are not to return evil for evil, that we are to turn the other cheek, we're to love our enemies and pray for those who persecute us? And these psalms then raise a couple of serious questions. Where is the love of God in light of these deprecations of human beings, in light of Jesus' teaching on loving your enemies? How can you pray for your enemies in a loving way, not in a cursing type of way? And then secondly, a theological question of what is the nature of the God whom the psalmist assumes would side with him to do such terrible things? Well, I think the answer to this question, or these questions, is not simple, and there is no easy answer. And I want to think about these psalms in terms of 9 possible aspects of interpretation that will help us in understanding these psalms. The first thing to consider is the nature of poetry itself. Poetry itself uses hyperbole, it uses metaphor to make its point, and it uses language in extreme ways to communicate the intensity of the psalmist's feelings. Like, have you ever had someone bite off your head in anger? Of course, we don't mean that literally, but that metaphor gives us a very visceral picture of the intensity of feeling. So you can always kind of dial these words back. That's the sense of this position, is that this language is extreme because it's poetry, so it's not meant to be taken literally. Another aspect of this issue is the contrast between the Old Covenant and the New Covenant, or the law of retribution and the law of love. The Old Testament taught a law of retribution, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, that private property and life were to be valued. And so if you took private property, or if you took someone's life, or if you took someone's wife, violated marriage, All of these things had high punishment, sometimes capital punishment, to communicate the value of these things. The cost of taking a life was so high because its value was so high. And so the Old Testament, the Old Covenant, taught us the value of things. And then Jesus comes along in a Sermon on the Mount, and he says, "You have heard it said," and he'll quote the Old Testament law, and then he'll follow it with this statement, "But I say to you," and he extends every one of those laws into a new realm, into the realm of the heart. And so perhaps there's an aspect of that happening here in these Psalms. While we read these Psalms, we need to be understanding that we're in the Old Covenant. We're before the gospel. We're before Jesus. And so we need to consider them differently. Romans 12:17 says, "Do not repay anyone evil for evil, but repay, heap burning coals on the heads of your enemies." In other words, by doing good, that's how we repay those who do evil to us. We do good back to them. So there is a new covenant, a new law that's in play. Number 3, understand that these curses in many cases are not personal, but they reflect the role of the king as an agent of God's justice. Often these curses come from David himself, and David is, of course, the king. And the king was authorized on God's behalf to administer justice, to judge justly, and to mete out punishment upon people and upon nations. And so in some cases, David here is speaking as the king. And the New Testament speaks of this in Romans 13, with the government being the agent of God, ordained by God to administer justice. Fourth, some have suggested that these verses of imprecation are predictions of future judgment, that the psalmist is not seeking personal vengeance against his enemies, but overall justice, and that his statements are predictive of what will happen to a person who violates God's laws. It is often described as the law of the harvest. A man reaps what he sows. In the Psalms, it is often portrayed as someone that sets a trap for someone else, and then they fall into it themselves. It recoils upon them. It's that idea that, yes, you reap what you sow, and so this is a prediction of what happens to the person who sets out to hurt others. Many of these Psalms are also prophetic and therefore messianic, and they weren't understood this way until after Jesus. And Jesus experienced betrayal and suffering, and so it's not surprising that the authors of the New Testament, the apostles, looked to these Psalms to explain what happened to Judas and the punishment that was due him. And so that's a possibility as well. That's not true of every imprecatory psalm, but many of them are prophetic, and they point to something greater than David's personal experience with betrayal. Number 6, it's also suggested that these are human words and not divine words. That is, the entirety of the Bible is the Word of God, but contained within the Word of God are the words of humans that are not necessarily correct. For example, the book of Job contains the words of Job and his friends, and we learn at the end of the book of Job that they're wrong. Those guys are wrong. And so perhaps that's what's happening here, is that the words of the psalmist are just honest human words that don't have the divine stamp of approval, but they do reflect exactly what the psalmist is feeling. They do reflect his righteous anger. Number 7, these psalms also are representative of human justice at all times. That there is injustice that happens in the world, and the psalmist is serving as a singular representative of that. He is the personification of that. And his experience of injustice, that is David's, the experiences of being betrayed, of being trampled upon, he becomes a metaphor for those in our world today who also suffer injustice and who would appeal to God for justice and to be angry. So we're not necessarily angry at a person, but at this thing called injustice. Number 8, some of these psalms are national and not personal. In fact, Psalm 137 that we quoted earlier, this prayer against the Babylonians, clearly that's a national anger that's being exhibited there. And we see this in some other psalms as well. And this is kind of like battlefield language. It's the kind of language that a soldier might use of an enemy across the field of battle, that on a personal level, they wouldn't feel that way. But there's anger against maybe a foreign nation that's invading or doing harm. And so it makes complete sense. We might even remember, for those of you that are old enough to remember 9/11 in the United States and the feelings of anger that our nation experienced for the attacks of 9/11. And finally, I would suggest, not so much as a matter of interpretation, but of application, is to look at these Psalms through a New Testament lens. The New Testament tells us that there is a person who is our ultimate enemy. A spiritual being who is a person, Satan, the adversary, the accuser. And so our hatred, our anger, our frustration should not be directed towards an individual human being, but to the one that ultimately is behind it all, the tempter, and the one who is at war with us. Ephesians 6 will speak of the armor of God, putting on the full armor of God, because we wrestle against spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. And so these are the enemies that we need to curse. And you might remember that Jesus himself cast out demons, that he cursed the demons. The man who was possessed by a legion of demons, the demons there begged Jesus, don't send us out of the area, and don't cast us into the abyss. But sure enough, Jesus cast them out. And so we appeal to Jesus, who is the sovereign ruler of all things visible and invisible. And we call upon him to do our cursing for us. He has authority and he has the power to do that. So there are 9 keys for understanding and interpreting these Psalms. They don't apply to every single imprecatory psalmist, but they give us some nuanced ways of explaining and applying these Psalms to our modern life.